What's up, everybody? Mr. Fantini here, and welcome to our very first video in this series on United States history. Now, studying history is all about cause and effect, and so before we can really get into the United States, we really have to turn back the clock and take a look at what happened before the United States was even a thing, and the factors that led to the United States becoming a thing. So in order to kind of lay that groundwork for American colonization, we're actually going to go all the way back to Spanish colonization and touch on Christopher Columbus. Now, if you've been watching the news, you know that Columbus has kind of been a subject of controversy in recent years, especially about the way that he's remembered in the United States. And we're really not going to dig into that controversy in this video. You can kind of evaluate that for yourself afterwards. But we do need to take a look at Columbus for what he was historically, which is to say, sort of the first step in the process of the colonization of the Americas by the Old World. Even though Columbus himself never set foot in what would later become the United States, his voyages and colonization of the Caribbean islands really wrote the playbook that other European countries would follow in establishing their own colonies in the Americas, including England in their colonization of North America, which would later become the United States. And so in order to understand why colonization looked the way it did, both in the Spanish Americas and the English Americas, we need to understand its causes and its context. And with that in mind, let's zoom in on Spain. And to start off here, we're actually going to turn the clock way back to 711 AD. This is over 1,000 years before the Declaration of Independence, so we're going to go fast through this early stuff. In that year 711, the Umayyad Caliphate, which was an Islamic empire, sometimes referred to as the Moors, generally speaking by Spaniards, invaded Spain from Morocco. A lot of people don't realize this, but Spain remains part of the Muslim world for the next 781 years. Most of the Spanish peninsula was ruled by North African princes who were Muslim, although these governments allowed general religious toleration actually, and most average Spaniards remained Catholic. But even though most Spaniards can continue to practice their religion, the Catholic Church as an institution becomes a lot less powerful under this Muslim government. And so the Catholic Church and the Spanish nobles, who are kind of pushed out as rulers by the Caliphate, naturally want to reclaim their power and influence in Spain, but they need to find a way to rally the support of the people who are actually going to be doing the fighting. So one way that they do this is they appeal to a new national and religious identity. The concept of Spain did not exist at this point. Prior to that point, the peninsula was ruled over by a bunch of different noble families who were rivals and periodically went to war with each other. But as a way to unify themselves against what they saw as a common enemy, they tried to emphasize their cultural similarity and their religious connection with one another as a way to define themselves as an in-group against the out-group, which were the Moors, as they called them. And so what we see in the primary sources of this time is literature and artwork that really emphasizes the differences between the Spaniards and the North Africans. They depict them as darker complexioned, they emphasize the cultural and religious differences between the groups, and the strategy here is that once you establish a group of people as fundamentally different, it becomes easier for the in-group to justify violence and discrimination against the out-group. And this is kind of a big picture concept that we're going to see a lot, so I want you to kind of file that in the back of your mind for later. So with this narrative in place, the Spanish nobles and their Catholic allies began a war known as the Reconquista, which, if you know a little bit of Spanish, you might be able to tell means the reconquering or the reclaiming. And this war kind of ebbs and flows in various forms over the course of the next 7 centuries until the Spanish nobility and their Catholic allies eventually expel the last Moorish government known as the Emirate of Granada from southern Spain in 1492. And important here, as we'll see later. Now, if you didn't catch that the first time, I'm going to say it one more time. This conflict, in one form or another, lasted 700 years. It's almost inconceivable to think of 700 years of warfare. And as you might imagine, 700 years of fighting totally transformed Spanish society. And here's where we really get into the key causes of Spanish colonization. We're going to break down these changes caused by the Reconquista into 4 categories: political, social, military, and economic. First, politically, meaning the structure of the Spanish government. As I mentioned a minute ago, before the conflict, the Reconquista, Spain didn't exist. It was a series of rival kingdoms that periodically allied with or fought against one another. Over the course of the conflict, those kingdoms unify with the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, creating the Kingdom of Spain. And fresh off this successful conflict, the Kingdom of Spain is very ambitious, it's on the rise, and it's going to look for new territory to conquer. Next, socially. Let's look at how this transformed Spanish society and the life of Spanish citizens. Again, as I mentioned a minute ago, we saw the creation of a new Spanish national and religious identity. This concept of Spanishness became merged with the concept of Christendom, which means like this unified purpose of Christians, which was sort of a function of the Reconquista and the Crusades, that very much defined itself as sharing a common cause against non-Christians. In both of those conflicts, they saw Christians going to war and feeling as though that war, that violence was sanctified by God. It was some holy purpose to go and fight against non-Christians. And don't misconstrue this. This doesn't mean that universally all Spanish Catholics at the time were prejudiced and bloodthirsty warriors or anything like that, but just know that this narrative, this type of story defined by the Reconquista and the Crusades, was ready-made in Spanish society. It was a familiar one. And as such a powerful narrative was bound to influence the interactions that they would have with natives in the New World, as we'll see. And a final social factor that will kind of like transition us into military factors is just how many people in Spain were trained for war at this time. By the end of the Reconquista, over 100,000 Spanish men had fought in war and were trained for war, and that's just a tremendous amount of the population at that point. This massive military class in Spanish society was partially caused by the Spanish cultural practice of primogeniture, which, just like it looks like primo means first, geniture, the same root word as genesis or to generate, basically means the practice of giving all of a family's possessions and lands and wealth and titles and privileges to the firstborn son of the family. And that rule is great if you're the firstborn son in the family. It's not so great if you're the second or third or fourth-born son of the family, or obviously if you're one of the daughters of the family, because women at this time didn't have that many rights. But this contributed to the growth of this military class in Spanish society because they had a society full of these second and third sons in need of a way to advance themselves. They weren't getting any property or wealth from the family, and so they had to find other ways to further their position in life. Many went into the priesthood or the church, others became traders and merchants, but during the Reconquista, there was money to be made in going off to war. And once the war was over, there were still thousands upon thousands of men whose main skill was fighting. Now, to continue this look at the military features of Spanish society, besides having so many trained fighting men, Spain had really honed its abilities as a military powerhouse over the course of the last 700 years of warfare, and by the end of the Reconquista, Spain is without a doubt the leading military power in the world. Not only because of their experienced soldiers and commanders, but also because of their centuries of warfare with the Islamic empires exposed them to the latest military technologies from the Islamic world. By the end of the Reconquista, Spain not only had thousands of skilled soldiers, but also made some of the best swords and guns and ships in the world. And lastly, let's talk about the least exciting, but historically speaking, probably the most important of these factors, economics. Obviously, 700 years of warfare is very expensive, and the Spanish crown had racked up a lot of debt over the course of the Reconquista. Following their victory, Spain begins to look outward for riches through trade and conquest, and it sees its neighbor doing something very interesting that it's going to try to emulate, which I'll go over in just a second. Luckily for Spain, this new need for trade coincided with the invention of a world-changing development in the field of navigation and sailing, the caravel, a small, fast, highly maneuverable ship that could sail very long distances, and was really a synthesis of European and Arab sailing technology. This would be the vessel that would kick off the age of exploration and colonization. And so with all that in mind, let's finally get to Columbus. Now, the reason Columbus kind of appears on the scene is because in 1453, Constantinople, which was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire and the most important trading city to Europe, was captured by the Ottomans, who raised prices on European traders. By the late 1400s, all of Europe wants access to Far Eastern goods like spices and silks and ivory and porcelain and all this other good stuff, mostly from India and China. And they don't want to pay the high prices charged by these Ottoman traders in Constantinople. Some European explorers are seeking to reach India by traveling eastward around Africa, and some of them are finding some success, most notably Portugal. By the mid-1400s, Portugal uses their caravels to sail around the Ottomans in North Africa and establish a trading post on the coast of West Africa. By doing this, they cut out the middleman, and they get much cheaper access to West African goods such as ivory and gold, and even slaves, which is going to become the biggest industry coming out of this. Now, because Portugal has access to these goods for far cheaper than anybody else, they make bank. They get rich. And other European colonies see this method, this idea of sending your ships out and establishing a trading post and then bringing the goods back, as a revolutionary new idea made possible by the caravel. By doing this, Portugal establishes the first maritime colonies of the age of exploration. And a maritime colony is just what it sounds like. It's where a foreign power controls a piece of overseas property where they get access to goods to bring back and make money off of. And now, at long last, we get Christopher Columbus. Columbus was a very experienced sailor from Genoa, which was a city-state in what is now Italy, and he theorized a westward trading route to China and India. Now, you might have heard at some point or another that Columbus proved that the Earth was round. No, that's not really true. Ancient Greek mathematicians proved that the Earth was a globe over 1,000 years earlier, and scholars and cartographers of Columbus's time knew that the Earth was a globe, and they knew where on this globe Europe and their destination, China and India, were. The issue was that there is a tremendous amount of ocean between the west coast of Europe and the east coast of China, and sailors of the time knew that if they tried to sail that distance, they'd run out of fresh water before they got to their destination, and they'd all die. Columbus gets his place in history because he made a very big mistake, but one that worked out in his favor. In calculating the Earth's circumference, Columbus became convinced that earlier scholars had made a mistake and that the Earth was actually much smaller than they thought, which would make Japan accessible in a westward voyage. He took this plan to just about every royal court in Europe, promising a westward trade route to Japan, but just about everybody thought he was crazy, and he actually traveled around Europe for years looking for some king or queen to give him enough money to try it out. It wasn't until 1492, in his fourth attempt to get some investment from the King and Queen of Spain, that they finally said, yeah, okay, Chris, here's some money, go crazy, and gave him 3 ships to try his westward trade route. He was dead wrong about the size of the Earth and his ability to reach Japan, but he lucked out because in trying and sailing west, he ran into a continent that the old world scholars didn't know existed. And at this point in the story, like always, it's important to examine our language and recognize that Columbus didn't discover America. It's impossible to discover something where people already lived, but he was the first of the old world scholars and navigators to encounter it. Sort of, because Viking navigators actually did reach Newfoundland in North America several centuries earlier, but we'll just disregard that for right now. At the time, he didn't know that it was a whole new continent. He thought he was just on some islands off the coast of India, which is why he called the islands the Indies, and the people who lived there Indians. These, of course, were both misnomers. The island that he was on was called Haiti by the local Taino people, but he called it Hispaniola, meaning New Spain. That island is now the home to the Dominican Republic and Haiti. The Taino people who lived there were universally regarded both by Columbus and his contemporaries as very generous and welcoming people who welcomed Columbus and his men on as guests. Unfortunately for the Taino, Columbus's arrival would spell doom for their culture. On that note, let's take a look at our primary source for today, which is actually an excerpt from Columbus's journals, which he recorded throughout his voyages and returned to Queen Isabella of Spain upon his return. In this excerpt, he recounts his early encounters with the Taino people. As soon as they see they are safe and have laid aside all fear, they are very simple and honest and exceedingly generous with all they have. They exhibit great love toward others in preference to themselves. I did not find, as some of us had expected, any cannibals among them, but on the contrary men of great deference and kindness. They do not bear arms, and do not know them, for I showed them a sword, and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron, their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all, and make them do whatever we want. Let us in the name of the Holy Trinity go on sending all the slaves that can be sold. As you'll see in the rest of your documents, what comes next for the Taino people is a brutal regime of exploitation, coupled with devastation by old world diseases that they had no immunity for. Now this moment, this contact, is undoubtedly a monumental moment in world history. Once these two worlds, the old world and the new world as they were called, were connected, there's no going back. And as historians, it's our job to analyze why the relations between old and new played out the way that they did. Columbus's voyages and eventually his regime over the Taino people will essentially write the playbook for future European powers to follow as they establish their own colonies. As you analyze these documents, think about the way that these aren't just the actions of one man, but one person being pushed forward by the forces of history. Years of conflict will color his understanding of how to interact with these new people, and the demand for a profitable colony from his Spanish investors will push him to define the relationship between the old world and the new world as an oppressive one. Unfortunately for the millions of people living in North and South America, at this point completely unaware of this monumental event that has taken place, Columbus's regime is just the beginning. But we'll get into that next time. I'll see you then.